The notion of Dostoevsky as a liberal, perhaps it should be called the paradoxical notion of Dostoevsky as a liberal. One of the advantages of this format of the YouTube channel is the possibility that when thoughts are fresh, they can be captured in greater vividness or color because of the immediate possibility of recording them rather than attempting to carefully put them down in some kind of essay or disquisition of some kind, which must be more organized. The starting point that struck me was this question of the supposed Hegelian liberalism, where I regard it as just a question within the overall notion of liberalism, which is more to do with an identity of modernity and the rearrangement of society because of the rise of people who live in cities rather than the bourgeois and engage in trade, which began to subsume all forms of society, including warriors and priests, so that everybody became involved in commerce more and more. And so, for example, in the 17th century, the word manufacture had its old meaning of somebody, a handicraft, somebody that manus, meaning hand, and fact, meaning to make. So that's interesting in its own right, that you see the rise of the new meaning of fact and things made, which then includes experimental scientific discoveries, which would be things made under specific practices, just as manufacturing involves specific repeated practices, which presumably can produce the same thing again and again. Like, for example, a Coca-Cola bottle. This sense of the inter-liberal problems, so the problems that arise within this new setting, then brings us this distinction between the people that say participation is the most important thing, which is more on the French and American side, and then Hegel, who says what's important is that you have a competent bureaucracy which can, let's say, look at it from the point of view of each of the parts of the American executive branch should be run competently, and that's a bit large question which touches on all the daily political issues like this. So either the issue of the so-called bureaucratic state or the so-called deep state, or that there be entrenched people in these departments under the executive that aren't elected, and then people say, just as they say with Supreme Court justice, that there's a problem if you have officials that aren't elected, and the problem is supposedly that the vote is the right which is preservative of all other rights, as the current top Supreme Court Justice Roberts put it. And this really signals the notion that democracy is supposed to be participatory. So it seems then to some people that Hegel, in saying we should prefer competency to the question of whether the officials got there through the participatory process, that the individual voters had a say in it, then seems anti-liberal to some people. But there's a negotiation within the larger meaning of, I use the term interchangeably, modernity or liberalism. Of course, the meaning classical liberalism, where Burke is a classical liberal conservative. So within that we have this problem where, therefore, I regard Hegel as being part of the modern situation, a modern in this sense, and he proposes that we should have a rational bureaucrat. So everybody in the and in a way, this is how they do it in England. Because, so for example, in England, where the new prime minister comes in, he only changes a couple people. Like, I think really only a dozen people or so change place in his new so-called quote-unquote administration, whereas in America, there'll be an attempt to gut as many people as possible and put in, we're talking thousands of people, and put in new people according to the new administration and usually it's a switch between Democrat and Republican every 8 years, but sometimes after 4 years. But that means a huge tumultuous change in the staff, and also with an eye to getting rid of the entrenched bureaucrats, which was, I suppose we see that in its purest form in the Soviet experience of the problem with entrenched bureaucrats who know all the tricks of preserving themselves and then become corrupt because they're more interested in preserving themselves than in serving the state. But I think in Prussia we did have a situation for at least from the end of Hegel's life to it's hard to say, maybe to World War I, that this so-called state of intelligence, this Hegelian state of intelligence, was pretty strong. And then finally you get the Schmidt saying in 1939 that the state of intelligence is over, because not because he didn't like the Nazis, he was a Nazi himself, but because he realized that this is no longer a question of running the country on the basis of sort of efficiencies and competencies, but it's his famous notion of the political. It's a matter of physical killing being in play and people having to take sides and so forth. So therefore Hegel's rational state is over. Sorry, is it 33, I guess, is when Hitler's party was voted in Weimar. So I think much earlier, I forget the date when Dostoevsky wrote Brothers Karamazov. It must have been around 1880 or so. So this question of a fully rational government which excludes participation in some way is analogous to this question of the Grand Inquisitor, who through sort of Catholic rationalism, Thomistic rationalism, let's say, would solve all the problems scientifically, so that people have nothing left to do themselves but to have respect for their, as was the case in Prussia, there was a great respect for authority, as it's always said from the American point of view, that the Nazis and in Germany had too great a respect for authority, but for rational authority, for people, for competency. So what strikes me as interesting here is that if you put Dostoevsky on the side of the people that are saying there should be more participation, how that's almost unintelligible, how that's more on the side of Christ. So first you have to put over it this lens of how does Kant understand liberalism. He understands liberalism as a situation where the will, so you already see Nietzsche's cropping up in the notion of autonomy, and the notion that the personal will is at bottom something like the how do they call it, freedom of conscience, like that the Quaker should be able to have freedom of conscience in regard to abstaining from a war that the state's in and so forth. That freedom of conscience, which in Kant is worked out through all kinds of metaphysical issues, like such as what's our access to reality, and how can you distinguish things, the is from the ought, in a very, not in the way that we now do it with the so-called facts and values, but in a more complex way. But taken from those problems, you get the problem of autonomy, which is like the problem of the will as it gets developed in Schelling and then in Nietzsche. And one can see that as a question of individual participation rather than somebody managing things properly, like this Grand Inquisitor, or like bureaucrats who really know how to, let's say, manage the health department or manage safety and welfare, or the FTC, you know, manage federal communications or whatever it is, really competent bureaucrats, and then everybody would just respect those bureaucrats, realizing they should just be let alone to exercise their competence. You get into a peculiar kind of analogy, so that what is Hegel saying? He's saying somehow that his bureaucrats would have access to this godlike position, so that it wouldn't be necessary for each individual to personally have their own autonomy, because simply by the objective situation of being in a society where those institutions are in place, and where through a certain history it's simply natural for anyone who grew into that society to have those attitudes, that it would work. Hegel is then in a certain sense making a position that doesn't quite fit into Dostoevsky's sense. So what if how would that, it's almost as though the Hegel wants to say that the Grand Inquisitor is simply like an Ehrstadt's state of intelligence. It's one where they haven't really reached the absolute, and they're not really in touch with what the pinnacle, as far as the standards would be of that would tell them what it is that their efficiency is aimed at. The efficiency refers to the sort of the means and the doings, and the pinnacle or the principle tells you exactly what you're supposed to be doing and why, and if it's good or not. So there's various versions of this, and I think it's interesting to point out that this is an issue that just gets not enough play, as the contest between participation as a goal in Kant's sense, that for instance, part of the participation is this so-called free speech, which keeps getting different treatments from decade to decade and from week to week almost, which Kant regarded as the the license to lie, the ability to lie. So this as a sort of wager, saying if people are given this freedom, instead of the state playing the part of the the ones that say we know what the truth is and we're going to sanction anyone who produces slanders or bad, I don't say bad information, but bad, because the bad information view assumes some kind of fact value distinction, which has already been worked out by some people, as it were, ahead of time, and then just hoisted on everyone. But as it were, the right guidance. That this freedom, which is like the freedom Dostoevsky is talking about, will ultimately lead to the right thing. And then I think if you read the Grand Inquisitor episode in that light, it shows the most, to use a kind of Schmittian phrase, the most intense and the most extreme form of this division between the road of the demand for total participation, or the demand for competent bureaucratic management, which I think in Prussia, with the sort of almost religious respect for high intellectual pursuits, including Hegel as a guide to the bureaucrats, this sounds like something good, whereas to us it sounds like, again, it sounds like the management bodies or biopolitics, where the managers have sort of this pseudo-Stalin attitude, this quote which is attributed to Stalin because it sounds good, not because he actually said it, about the statistics being, about the million deaths being a statistic and one death being a tragedy. So we have different attitudes towards the possibility of merely being efficiently merely living in a country that is run efficiently and not having to worry about the ultimate guidance in our existence, what we're here for. And then this Dostoevskian version, where the participation takes on a totally different meaning than it takes on in our version, where it's meant to be, people are meant to be informed somehow, and the informed choices are meant to be potent and to somehow be objective. But okay, so just raising some issues which, if they could be sorted out, I think it would not be wrong to take profoundly.